Do you have to be a wedding photographer, a wedding planner? Do you have to be someone who is in the event and in the wedding space to listen to this podcast and to get useful tidbits from the podcast? This is a question that I've addressed in the past, and I think it's okay for me to address again today because it would appear that from interactions that I've been having here and there with you gentle listeners, it would appear that not everyone is 100% in the wedding and the event space, as I assumed when I started this podcast. So when I started this podcast close to 2 years ago, oh yeah, we've done 1 year. Okay, yeah. So when I started this podcast close to 2 years ago, it was my assumption that the gospel that I was going to preach over here on the podcast would resonate really well with people in the wedding and the event space, because after all, that is sort of like my native constituency. I mean, that's where I came from in a business sense. If we want to disregard my the 3 or 4 years where I was a lawyer and then employed in the civil service. So I assume that would be my primary constituency. But the more that I chat with listeners who do reach out, I found out that we have listeners all over the place. I've spoken to a lawyer, I've spoken to someone in financial services. Then there was that podcast episode about what a masseuse can learn from the podcast, because I know a masseuse who listens to the podcast regularly. Let's see what else. People in the tech and in the design space. And it looks like, even though my initial intent was to speak to people in the wedding space and in the event space, it looks like there are other people from other industries who find value from the podcast. And of course, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, since one of the things that I preach about on the podcast all the time is that a multidisciplinary approach is a good way to grow your business, because you can always learn stuff from other people in other business segments that you can apply to grow your own business. Especially since some of the theory that we talk about here anyway, especially when we make reference to Tom Hopkins, I mean, that's stuff that has been developed for the real estate industry, and then a couple of other sales gurus who made stuff for the financial services industries, but they find applications in weddings and events and carpentry or whatever it is that you are engaged in. So the answer is no. You don't have to be a wedding photographer, a videographer. You don't have to be a wedding planner. You don't have to be in this space to find value on the podcast. And so, even though you listen to the podcast and you hear me sign off every day with the name of the podcast, Sales for the Nigerian Wedding Industry Podcast, you can still hang on here, because you're going to find useful stuff. And of course, you don't have to be a Nigerian, because the business principles that we discuss here and the selling principles that we discuss here apply across different boundaries as well. And also, yet again, to my surprise, even though this is called Sales for the Nigerian Wedding Industry, for some reason, a lot of the listeners, most of the listeners, I'd say close to 70% of the listeners are from outside the country. So Americans, UK people, let's see, where else? Even surprised that we have people in Eastern African countries that listen to the podcast. So you don't have to be Nigerian. You don't have to be in the wedding and the event space. There's loads of stuff that you can learn. In fact, in my most recent discussion with someone who is in the UX space, user design. I think they call it UX, but for we lay people, we will call it user design. That's basically making sure that when you design your website or your products, your apps or whatever, just making sure that the design is easy to use, is intuitive, so that your potential clients don't have a difficult problem using your product. Because if they have a problem using your product, then they're just going to move off to someone else who addresses the problem much more directly and who has a much more easier interface to use. So for people, where was I? Yeah, so the conversation that I had with someone in the UX space, he thought it was a gospel that applies to people in that industry, because he claims, and I guess it's not something peculiar to people in the tech space, in the UX space, he claims that people in that side of the business universe, that they over-index on technical skills. So they're worried about programming language, what else, colors, design schemes, what's it called, user something charting, I can't remember, all those things that figure out when you open up a software, where do you start with and how do you flow through the whole thing. So he says yes, that they over-index when it comes to the technical things at the expense of being able to have conversations one-on-one with clients, to get people from hello to thank you very much for your purchase, and to getting them to come back and bring their friends and their family, for not just for repeat business but also for new business. So he says that people in that side of the business globe over-index on the technical skills, and it's something that I can relate to because it also happens a lot in the wedding and the event space as well. So you find cake bakers worried about whether they have the latest and the greatest oven or the greatest mixer, or what else, or the right kind of sugar imported from France or whatever. And then photographers are worried about megapixels and the latest camera and sensor size and f-stop, and on and on and on. And basically, people just over-indexing on the technical. So that's something that we can learn over here on this podcast. That yes, it's nice to pay attention to the technical aspects. Yes, you should be worried about attention flows. If you're, if you design apps, yes, it's important that you worry about where the customer starts from, where they move through, what the colors are like, what the what the work sequence is like. And if you're a photographer, then yes, megapixels and bits and bytes are important, and f-stops and shutter speed, and then all of that. But beyond that, there's a process of looking for the customer, finding the customer, initiating the conversation with the customer, making sure that you establish that there's value on both ends, value to you, value to them, and then being able to get them to take that next step, which is to secure your services, to design the app, or to be the wedding photographer, or to be the plumber or the photographer, or to be the architect for the project, or to be the installation guy for the solar panels, or whatever it is that you do, whatever it is that you sell. So in summary, that's what I have for today on the podcast. You don't have to be in the wedding space to get value from this. So please, by all means, listen on, no matter what industry that you are involved in. Hopefully you're involved in ethical industries. Don't take this knowledge and use for anything nefarious. And remember that let us stop over-indexing on the technical stuff. The technical stuff, the creative stuff, it's a lot easier to latch onto because, that's what got our hearts in the first place. For those of you who are photographers, that's what did it for you. You took that wonderful photo, and then people kept going on about how good you are and everything. And it's the same for the UX guys. You designed something and people are like, oh, you're the god of design and all of that. So yes, that was the emotional pull, the technical and the creative side. But it's not necessarily what it is that is going to keep us staying long in the business and making progress. So don't over-index on the technical and still keep listening to the podcast, even if you're not a wedding person. So thank you very much for listening to the Sales for the Nigerian Wedding Industry podcast. I'm your host, Abuja-based sales consultant and event media professional, Tavishima Ayede. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll catch you guys at the next recording.